This is a University of Otago podcast.
I walk when I speak and think, so I'll walk quietly. Right, now we're with it. Thank you for the opportunity to contribute to what's a very interesting and stimulating subject. I apologise for my lateness this morning. I had been at a breakfast at the Forsyth Bar Stadium to launch the Salvation Army's Red Shield appeal for this week. And it brings it home to me that while we do have a strong and growing economy, there are still a great number of families who are in very vulnerable circumstances and who struggle on a day-to-day basis. The speaker at the breakfast was Professor Harlene Hayne, our Vice-Chancellor at the university, and she is one of the world's leading researchers. In fact, she is on co-chair of a committee that reports directly to the Prime Minister on matters of social challenge, including family violence, adult sexual violence and so on, and helping us develop evidence-based policies that will improve the lot of people. And I think that when we talk about pay and pay gaps and income inequality, I'm very keen to ensure that we do have an evidence-based approach to the solutions that we come up with, accepting that there are very strong philosophical differences in approaching the same issue. So I'm going to offer you a few thoughts today. How long have I got, Rob? 15, 20 minutes. So let's talk for 15, 20 minutes and hopefully leave some time for questions, comments, observations and criticisms. Because one of the things as a politician that I miss, that I regret we don't do enough of, is getting below the surface of a lot of these issues, because they are incredibly complex and multifactorial. We don't have all the answers. It's just difficult enough trying to articulate the question in a certain way. So I hope to, for some of the comments I make, I'm sure some of you will agree strongly, some of you will disagree strongly, and some will be a bit in the middle. I hope what we can do is just stimulate that discussion. Now, Mark talked about the regulatory framework, light touch regulation. And I agree with that. I particularly agree with it in the context of workplace relations and safety, or at least workplace relations, where Parliament should be setting the regulatory environment to enable two parties, the employer and or their representative, and the employee and or their representative, to negotiate in good faith for a successful agreement to work in return for pay and other benefits. For someone who holds that view, I seem to be doing an awful lot of regulating right now, and I think that reflects the backdrop that we're in. So I want to just touch on a few of the things that we are firstly responsible for and then doing. John's just talked about strategic pay in the context of the higher end of town, although I did appreciate your later comments around that, the lower pay, and that's pretty much where the government works. The government sets policy around minimum things: minimum wage, minimum employment standards, minimum rates of holidays, minimum health and safety standards. And then it gets into some quite tricky issues around the way in which those agreements are negotiated. And the two very interesting policy conundrums that we have at the moment, actually the policy conundrum is not the problem, it's actually trying to find the solution. The first is 0 hours. There's been a lot of talk in New Zealand since basically I took over the portfolio in October last year around the concept of a 0 hours employment agreement. I'm pleased to note that late last night McDonald's and the Unite Union came to a meeting of the minds in their agreement. That's good for two reasons. It's obviously good for the workers. It's pretty good for McDonald's, actually, from a reputation perspective. I think, Mark, you talked about that fellow in Wellington, the burger operator, whose business is dead. There's no other way to describe it. The treatment of customers in that way is just terminal for a business. And if you want to know who's the other really struggling business at the moment, thanks to their slowness to respond to public criticism about their relationship with their staff, think about Cotton On. Because Cotton On took days to respond to a comment that spread like wildfire and damaged their brand. But the government doesn't want to be in that space. The government wants to leave those arrangements, which are effectively contractual ones, offer and acceptance with consideration, to the parties to it, not to the courts, not to Parliament. The 0 hours issue is a really interesting one because it has and I think it's symptomatic of nomenclature that we use in the employment relations framework that means different things to different people. And I think what we talk about when we talk about pay, gap, income inequality, all often has different meanings. Now, for me, there are only 4 types of employment agreements, and 0 hours doesn't fit neatly into any one of those boxes. The first one is a permanent full-time agreement. The second is a permanent part-time agreement. The second is a fixed-term agreement for a specific purpose. That might be to cover maternity leave, and that could either be full or part-time. And the last type is a casual agreement. What we have with 0 hours is effectively a casual agreement with hooks. That is, I'm not going to commit to you any hours of work, but you have to commit to me to be on call. Now think about that in the context of a piece of equipment. Let's say you go down, Mark goes down to High Equip and says, see that generator in the corner? I want it to be available for my exclusive use, but I don't want to pay for it, except when I use it. But you, High Equip, you're not allowed to hire it out to anybody else. Now, I can't tell you when I'm going to need it, but that'll be fine by me. You would be laughed out of the premises. You would be told to just go away. If we don't do that for our equipment, why on earth would we expect it to be right to do it to our staff? And when I was, and I can give you a long story about how Campbell Live have covered this and lampooned me, when I was talking about some of the rostering practices that are going on in some of these outlets, this is just really bad management. This is dumb management. Because one of those retail outlets, that shall remain nameless, but has an outlet on Andersons Bay Road, has a 58% turnover of staff. So those staff are voting with their feet. Sadly, they are often going to other organisations that treat them equally badly. So we need to find a solution that makes unlawful the worst practices of what is known as 0 hours. So the mutuality of obligations principle, I commit, you commit, has to be built into our employment relations law. That is way harder than it sounds. Easy to understand, to articulate the goal. It's very hard to write a law that does not create unintended consequences or leave loopholes. And effectively, my hope is that we eliminate 80% of the dysfunctional behaviour in that negotiating process by setting the law. We won't eliminate all of it. What's encouraging about what's going on at the moment is that just talking about it is talking these agreements out of existence. And actually the reputation risk is high for anybody that is labelled a 0 hours employer. There are a couple of other things that we're dealing with in that context as well in terms of restraint of trade, which is effectively the on-call issues. Lack of compensation for short notice cancellation of rosters. Again, that's just bad management. It's really hard to outlaw bad management. And the last one is the drive-offs issue, which you might have seen in the media late last year again, where a service station deducted the costs of a thief. Now, again, this is a really easy issue to articulate. It's hard to write into law. So, for example, if you want to, this is where there's a white area, a black area, and a very big grey area. We know accidental breakage and loss should not be picked up by the employee. That's unfair. We know that the deliberate action of actually, and this happened, is contributing to the theft. So you're a party to the theft. Clearly that needs punishment and sanction, including the reimbursement of that. But in the middle, what do? Let's say you're the night shift supervisor at the Z service station in Andersons Bay Road, and somebody drives off. On the face of it, that seems like it would be unfair to deduct. What if the employer had twice warned that staff member not to be out in the office out the back and not paying attention and reading his auto magazine when somebody comes onto the forecourt, and by that, some could say gross negligence, caused loss? How do you build that into a law? Well, actually, you do it through the grievance process, the personal grievance or performance management, effectively. But that part of performance management has to include some kind of sanction for poor performance. Should it be a financial one? Now, that one example is one of about 100 I've got at the moment to try and juggle in terms of creating the right environment to create a fair and productive workplace in New Zealand. Because what you talked about, that culture, what term did you use, John? Oh, an entitlement culture. There is definitely that in New Zealand. And there is an envy that emerges out of very high salaries. But I think there's also a very egalitarian culture in New Zealand, a culture of fairness. And that's why the 0 hour stuff bounced up so strongly. Because actually people listened and thought, no, that's just not fair. And again, you wouldn't know this from Campbell Life, but I agreed with them. Just to let you know, the other area that I think will be a very, very interesting one in terms of pay and pay equity is the case of Christine Bartlett versus Terra Nova, which went before the Court of Appeal. Christine Bartlett is an aged care worker in the Lower Hutt, and she has been supported by the Service and Food Workers Union to take a case against her employer under the Equal Pay Act. Now, the Equal Pay Act was passed in 1972 in New Zealand to provide, by a national government I should say, to provide equal pay for equal work between men and women in the private sector. The Holyoake government had previously done that in the public sector in about 1967. Now, that would seem obvious on the face of it. What Christine Bartlett and Service and Food Workers Union argued was that equality also meant equity, and that it wasn't enough for the employer just to compare a man and a woman doing the same job in the same workplace, but that if that workplace and that industry is dominated by women and is characterised by systemic low pay, that was in breach of the Equal Pay Act. Now, Terra Nova argued that that was a very long bow to draw, incredibly long bow. Equal pay means equal pay. Man and a woman doing the same thing should get the same pay. Very strong argument and retort. If anybody's really interested in this, I encourage you, it's not a very long judgment, but the judgment of the Court of Appeal is actually a very good one, very sensible. It goes through the history of equity because, and not our finest hour, the national government actually repealed a pay equity legislation in early 1991 as part of its Employment Contracts Act reforms, on the basis that equity would look after itself. But it doesn't. And that's what Justice French, the head of the Court of Appeal, said. Now, I actually think, while I don't know what we're going to do about it, by the way, and I can't let you in on any secrets, I saw Peter McIntosh here before. Is there anybody else from the media here? Oh, great. Oh, yes, sorry. You are. Great. I don't know what the government's going to do yet about that, but I think it was a pretty sensible decision, and one which is going to challenge both workers and the government to come up with the right answer. There's probably multiple answers. Now, where does equity in that sense come from? Well, I think the question of equity and income inequality has a very, very long gestation. My mother was a registered nurse. My late mum was a registered nurse. She was the first nurse at Dunedin Hospital to work in the operating theatres after she was married. Can you imagine what a waste that is? And it happened as little as 50, 60 years ago, that if you got engaged while you were doing your nursing training, you were kicked off the course. When you got married after you became a registered nurse, you went home and looked after your husband. And as a consequence, nurses in New Zealand were paid a spinster's wage. That's what it was known as. Police officers, of course, they were all men, mostly. So they had to look after the family. Therefore, their salaries were higher, just for being men. Now, we've long since gone past that. But the sequelae of that framework, I would suggest, exists still in some of our REM. Now, the previous Labour government got criticised heavily, by us, of course, for putting huge amounts of money into the health sector and not getting anything out of it. That was only mostly true, because some of that did have to go into remedying that inequity between similar professions. Now, what the Terra Nova case now does is takes that down into a lower level and suggests that there should be equity across industries and across occupations that would not normally be lined up, simply because the people doing them are predominantly women. And that's going to be one of the most significant, I think, challenges for employment relations in this country over the next couple of years. So that's my direct influence over the setting of the pay and remuneration framework. But the employment relations framework is only one part of the government's role in this issue. What are the others? Well, taxation. Clearly taxation and who pays what over what thresholds has a significant impact on what you take home. And we are very strongly in favour of a broad-based low-tax framework, which is what we didn't have as much as we would like when we came to office. So Bill English did a very big tax reform review, including the questions of things like capital gains tax, stamp duties, progression, value-added taxes, and so on. And that led to the lowering of all tax rates to the point where now nobody under $48,000 pays more than 17.5 cents in tax, and a lowering of the top tax rate from 39% to 33%. We saw those tax rates creating arbitrage by the upper income workers, and you've heard lots of critical comments about the top 50 or 100 net worth individuals in New Zealand not paying the top tax rate. Well, they do now because the top tax rate's gone down. But the further you get the trust and company tax rates out of kilter with the personal tax rates, the more backdoors you open for tax accountants to reduce their tax liabilities. So that's a significant issue in terms of the gap. What are the others? Well, non-income related supports, so working for families and accommodation supplements are a particularly important part of supporting low-income New Zealanders. I say low, but I should mean lower, because you can have a salary of over $100,000 in New Zealand and still qualify for working for families. You probably have to breed like my parents, but you would definitely still qualify. Accommodation supplements also are very important because we know that there are significant affordability issues in Christchurch and Auckland, and so for those people they get accommodation supplements. But then there's the less direct things, public health services. Free public health, and particularly in acute care, very important. Education, the most indirect but important investment New Zealand can make in wealth is in education, in my view. And that's why we've invested very heavily in improving the standards of secondary education. We have some of the highest and brightest secondary students in the world. But the gap between the top and the bottom in our education is growing. You know, the boys I went to school with in the 80s who weren't going to be the rocket scientists or the academics might have gone and been plumbers or mechanics, say. But a car now has 12 or 13 separate computers. You cannot go in to do a mechanical apprenticeship unless you have NCEA 2 in English and Maths. We've got to get that stuff up. So education is a very important contributor to this. And then there's the broader economic backdrop. So John talks about a time when we used to arbitrate for a 10% increase in pay. What he didn't tell you was that we probably had a 14% inflation rate at that time. And the very benign economic conditions that we have at the moment are interesting from a perception perspective, because I would suggest that most of us would rather have 4% pay increase and 6% inflation than zero inflation and a 1% pay increase, even though we're better off in real terms by the latter, not the former. Now, when I left school, I was a distracted teenager and didn't want to go to university, so I joined the National Bank. And in 1987, I was giving out residential mortgages in New Zealand, in Wellington. The A mortgage was 19.5%, and the B mortgage was 20.5%, and we couldn't keep up with demand. Why? Because house price inflation was exceeding that. Actual inflation was even higher. Was nearly as high, actually. It never got to those heady heights. But that is not an environment for stable economic and wealth growth. So we don't want to go back to those pre-Roger Douglas days. So those are the machineries, the levers that government can pull. I control some of them. In fact, I haven't mentioned immigration. I'll just finish on immigration, because immigration policy is actually a very important contributor to workplace value and the way in which we treat our workers. Do you know at any one time there are about 160,000 non-New Zealanders working legally in New Zealand doing jobs, or eligible to. 117,000 of them are on what we call open work visas. So they're our working holiday makers. Some of us would have gone to the UK and done the same thing. Well, they're coming in return, and also from South America, Europe, Asia, Canada, and so on. There's about 60,000 of them. There's about 90,000 students studying in our universities, polytechs, and PTEs from overseas. About 50,000 of them have work rights for up to 20 hours a week. So there's another. So it takes us to about 110, 112,000. There's another 42 or 43,000 who are on what we call labour market tested work visas. They are on our fishing boats, our farms, in our orchards, in our rest homes. They're helping us rebuild Canterbury. And of course the obvious political question is, why on earth, when we've got about 58,000 job seekers, dole recipients in the old language, and 43,000 overseas workers doing labour market tested work? That's a very good question, actually, but again, the answer is hard, and there are a number of reasons for that. There is a skill and geographic mismatch between where the jobs are and where the people are. Now, in the 1930s, my grandfather picked up my baby mother and her siblings and drove them to Invercargill, because that was the only place he could find work. They'd just bought a house here in Dunedin but couldn't afford to live in it, so they rented it out and went to Invercargill to find the only work they could. We New Zealanders are the greatest travellers in the world. Why is it that I can't get people to go from Dunedin to Alexandra to pick stone fruit? Why is it that our farms from Waitaki to Invercargill have 1,200 Filipino farm workers and their family members working on those farms? Now, that's the political question. It's a really, really hard one. The answers are complex. They relate to education and skills, and those two things are not the same. They relate to attitude. They relate to recreational drug and alcohol use. Those are all barriers to placing some of those people into work. But I get very annoyed with employers who say they are unemployable. They're dropkicks. We cannot afford to accept that. I'd be naive to think that there weren't significant barriers for some of our young into work. And we have to remove those barriers one by one and set greater expectations for work as the pathway out of poverty. Because the CPAC, what are they called? The Child Poverty Action Group. Sorry, I had a little brain fade there. A few years ago, criticised the New Zealand government for its narrow focus on work as the pathway out of poverty. Well, here's the news flash. Work is the only way out of poverty. And until we can place more people into work and give them a pathway out of those minimum wage jobs, because that's what they're called, minimum wage, then they will always struggle. And I make no apology at all for the government's relentless focus on work as that pathway. Now, the budget's only 3 weeks away. You can hear a little bit more about what we might do in that space. But we have increased the work expectations on job seeker recipients. We have reintroduced youth rates. I agree with Mark. The abolition of youth rates caused unemployment in the under 24 age group to go up at a time when the recession was just starting to hit. I don't apologise for 90-day trials. 90-day trials, do you know how many recent migrants have come to me to say, I got a chance? I got a chance that employer wouldn't have taken with me otherwise, and that was all I wanted. Mums returning to parents were returning to the workforce. Most of them are mums. Young people who didn't do as well as they could at school, but they're sharp and they're motivated. And that's the issue with the minimum wage and the living wage. That I firmly agree with the previous speakers about the living wage. It's a great concept. It has significant unintended consequences. Because as an employer, if I look at someone who's 35, just been made redundant, otherwise skilled, and has got a lot to offer, and I look at a 17-year-old just leaving school, keen but inexperienced, and I'm expected to pay the same living wage of $19.25, who am I going to pick? It's not rocket science that the younger people could miss out, are missing out. So those youth minimum wages and those 90-day trials have been, in my view, a significant benefit for our young. Look, I'll leave it there. How long have we got? We've got a few minutes for questions.